the colonizers out, Indonesia was still, there were still like some traces of colonial exploitation, and it was still like a semi-feudal country, much like the Philippines is back then, or even now, I guess. Even today, because like our politicians are still like very corrupt. Like all the years growing up, it's like if I watch like Indonesian TV, like they always talk about corruption, and it's still a thing today. So
People say that colonization is over and that we had our so-called independence after the Katipunan Revolution, but we're not free. Family dynasties and the abusive elite are still determining so much of our leadership and governance, and the class struggle is still very, very, very strong here in the Philippines. International exploitation is still a reality in the Philippines.
I'm a former political prisoner from the Philippines during the martial law regime. In 1972, when martial law was declared by Ferdinand Marcos Sr., I was in my first year high school. I was not an activist because I was only young, but where I live is in my neighborhood is always an area where the demonstrators would always pass by. I never really understood what they were saying when they were chanting, down with imperialism, down with feudalism, down with bureaucrat capitalism. This is 1972, and at first year, I didn't even learn those things in the Philippine history. The demonstrators converged, no? You had students, you had farmers, you had workers demonstrate, and I saw through TV, through television, and listening to radios, these actions of the what is now known as the First Quarter Storm. When martial law was proclaimed, all of those things were gone. Activists were arrested in the hundreds, some says in the thousand by the time all of this arrest was done. It looks quiet, right? In the superficial level, it looks like there is peace and order. Why there is peace and order? The military is in charge. There is curfew. All the newspapers were shut down, meaning what you read is actually controlled by the Marcos government.
it's interesting because when I was learning about like Marcos's rule in the Philippines, it's kind of similar, and everything led to like this one incident in 1965, which was the 30 September movement. There was a kidnapping of 7 like high-ranking generals in the Indonesian army by lower-ranking soldiers, and some members of the communist leadership was implicated in this plot. But the operation was botched, and they all ended up being murdered. The details of the event is unclear because there's a lot of propaganda because it's so hard to like to power. And then over the next 30 years, like you basically couldn't talk about this. What we at least know is that only a small circle of the communist leadership were involved in this plot. So unfortunately, Suharto, who was one of the generals in the army, he used this as a pretext to overthrow Sukarno for like supporting this coup attempt over, I guess, 1965 and 1966. He like instigated this mass murder campaign where 500,000 and up to 1 million like communists were killed, and it wasn't just like the Communist Party itself. It was also like the mass organizations related to them. So they were all like either killed, like straight up lynched in the streets, not even like properly tried and executed, but there were several hundreds of thousands of people who were arrested and imprisoned for the next like 5-10 years. I guess that was like our last attempt of having like a militant, somewhat militant like left-wing movement, because afterwards, of course, like communism was banned. It still is to this day. And Suharto ruled as a dictator for the next 3 decades. So he was only deposed in 1998.
There was definitely a massacre that happened during that like political unfolding, and it definitely traumatized the citizens, you know?
I see a lot of our students, leaders are being arrested. There was massive surveillance of the campuses and student leaders in different organizations. At the time, there is what we call the underground movement. There is a big infrastructure that have become the refuge to be able to fight and resist the Marcos government safely.
There's a lot of like commonalities between the Philippine Liberation Movement and the left-wing movement in Indonesia, or at least what was attempted. in the 50s and in the 60s. Similar to how like the National Democratic Front of the Philippines operates now, which is a coalition of like mass organizations, trade unions, peasant organizations who work to improve material conditions in the Philippines and tackle the problems of feudalism, imperialism, and capitalism. There were also like lots of mass organizations that were linked to the Communist Party.
So I joined that, and that's where I got arrested. When they was about to untie me, it's like 20 people, 20 military men around me, watching me. Right? And I was afraid because these guys were so mad that they said, "You better tell us something because we just came from a raid that we got nothing. We need something from you." I said, "I know nothing. I know nothing." I asked when it was over, I said, "Can I get to put on my clothes? Am I allowed to put on my clothes now?" I put it on and I said, "Can I get my watch, please?" And they said, "Where is it?" I said, "And don't worry, nothing's gonna be lost here except your life." That's what they said to me. So I was in pain. Every time I recall it, it looks like fresh to me. That's 1982. And today is 2022. But that kind of pain and situation is very fresh. And I think it's very fresh because number one, the people like me who are activists continues to be arrested, tortured. We fought for change. The change during the time of martial law resulted into the ouster of Marcos in 1986.
Despite that, Indonesia still has a pretty strong labor and peasant movement, especially like in the recent years. I've been hearing more and more about it, so I feel like there's been like a kind of resurgence. I think the best advice I can give is to get involved and to organize, and that's for a few reasons. So I think when you're organized, you become more aware of not only the struggle you're organizing for, but also the other adjacent struggles. You start to make connections between them. You start to realize it's the same struggle.
We need to unite as one country, unite the Filipino people to not only to resist, but to unite them on what the vision is.
A liberated Indonesia heals from the colonial trauma that we held, and its path to independence. That was a rough start, honestly, and I feel like that's why we kind of are the way we are. So in an ideal world, Indonesia, they're so focused on themselves. They're focused on thriving as a nation that considers and takes care of their people first and foremost. It's not corrupt. It's not about having a fatter pocket. It's about how are you serving the community, how are you bettering the greater good. And I feel like a part of it is just reevaluating where your values stand as a community.
There are certain communities who've resorted to despair, and there are communities who are mostly youth-led, are so energized and are so hopeful, which kind of makes sense too, because they're going to have to inherit the realities, the economic and structural realities. But I think that the youth are going to spearhead a lot of the liberatory movements, whether that may be here or in so-called North America. Of course, with the guidance of a lot of elders who have kept their hope alive. I think that it's important, as somebody who believes in ancestor work, I think that to have intuitive access to the guidance of our ancestors, who I believe are still guiding us, especially those who have revolutionized. I don't just mean blood ancestors, but also those who have influenced us in different ways.
I draw my strength from the courage of the people that I work with to continue to fight and resist every day. Organize and mobilize, but you need to be continuously educating yourself to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We must agitate
organize and recognize. We must fight, agitate, organize and recognize. We must fight, agitate, organize and recognize. We must fight, agitate, organize and recognize. We must fight.